Hi, everyone. Welcome to the first ever One America Movement Candid Conversations. A good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are in this country or around the world. We are so glad to have you with us. My name is Andrew Hanauer. I am the president and CEO of the One America Movement. We are a national organization that is working to combat what we would consider to be toxic forms of polarization and division in American society. If you're one of the millions of Americans who looks out at the country and sees those toxic divisions, sees people grouping into these us versus them mentalities, and wants to see our country work better for everybody, we ask you to join us. We would love for you to join us, no matter what religion, what race, and what political identity you hold. We also know that a lot of folks are really looking for real conversations in this country about the issues that matter. At One America, we bring people together, and we believe in bringing people together, but we bring them together not to sort of paper over our differences or pretend that we all believe the same thing. We bring people together in part to work together on issues that matter in their communities and to talk about the really hard stuff in our society. And so as we start this series on Candid Conversations, that's what we're trying to do, is have real conversations. We believe people are ready for that. They want that. If you think about any presidential debate you've ever watched, just consider this the opposite of that, right? This is where we're going to have actual conversations, not talking points and sound bites. We will not always agree with what we hear on this show. You will not always agree with what you hear on the show, but you'll know that it'll be real and it'll be candid. So with that, I'm very excited to announce our first guest today, Dr. Ted Johnson. Dr. Ted Johnson is a senior fellow at the Brennan Center for Justice, where he does work exploring the role of race in electoral politics and in policy outcomes. He has done a lot of things in his career. He's a retired commander in the U.S. Navy. He was a White House fellow, and he was even a speechwriter to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. His work has appeared in a who's who of publications, from the Washington Post, the Atlantic, New York Times Magazine, and even just yesterday, the National Review, which is one of the things we'll be talking about. And he is the author of the forthcoming book, When the Stars Begin to Fall, about national solidarity and racism in America. Ted, thanks so much for joining us. Really glad to have you.
Always good to be here. Thank you. Always good to talk to you.
Yeah, likewise. I shake your hand. I don't know how that.
Yeah, exactly.
There we go.
The elbow with COVID.
Yeah, exactly. If my hand actually went through the screen, that'd be exciting. I really appreciate you coming on. I know we have a lot to talk about, especially around the topic of your book and how it relates to what's been going on in our country in the last couple of weeks. These are real, candid conversations. So we're going to start with the hard stuff, which is that our staff was having a pretty vigorous debate the other day about whether or not fruit ever belongs in cake. Can you comment on that?
This is a tough one.
It's not tough.
So in cake, I'm going to have to go with no.
Okay, good.
On cake might be acceptable depending on the type of fruit.
Got it.
Yeah.
All right. Well,
fruit cake is always a no, by the way.
I think you're on my side, but you may have hedged a little bit. In all seriousness, when we do our work at One America, bringing people together, we don't start with what's your opinion of, earned income tax credit, right? We start with building relationships. So before we get into the topics today, would love for you to just share with folks, what's something you want people to know about you as a person or about who you are?
So I think the biggest thing is I grew up middle class in North Carolina, went off to college, then went off to the military. Not because I had this dream of serving the country. I certainly had nothing against it, but I was a math major who didn't want to go to grad school and didn't want to teach. But I wanted to work and not go back to my parents' house. The military sort of provided me a job that was respected, that paid relatively well, considering that I was a math major, and provided me sort of like a rite of passage into manhood, which I kind of felt I needed at 22, and space and time to think about who and what I wanted to be. What was supposed to be 4 years turned into 20. And I reinvented myself after, in the military, after you do 20 years, you can essentially retire and go do something else, which is what I did. And so I think the one thing I want folks to know about me is that the person I am today was not who I aspired to be when I was young. A decade ago, I never would have thought I would be here right now. And frankly, 5 years ago, I don't know that I could have envisioned where I am now, because I didn't recognize all of the opportunities that were available because I was just a military guy at the time. And so my life has been sort of this a constant journey of trying to figure out who and what I am. What am I like? What's my purpose? What am I doing here? And then as I get some meat on those bones, how do I actually do that stuff?
Yeah.
And I don't know that I've figured it out, but the thing is, the journey has always been the part that's been the most exciting to me. I don't sit still very well, so that's kind of me in 30 seconds or so.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. I think it really speaks to how we never know what direction our lives might take.
Yeah,
how
sure.
has not sitting still well played out for you in quarantine for the last 3 months?
So it's been great, actually, for two reasons. One is family time is great. And again, spending so many years in the military, I mean, I was on ships when my first kid was born. I wasn't even there. He was months old before I saw him. Lots of travel, lots of deployments. And so you miss out on not just birthdays and that sort of thing, but just the everyday soccer practice and laughing over dinner. So I feel like I'm kind of making up, getting back some of those moments, because we're all here together all day, every day. The other thing is I'm putting the finishing touches on the book, on my book. So I finished the manuscript, sent that off to the publisher. They did their thing and sent back edits. And the edits came back just as quarantine was starting to happen. Mm-hmm. And so it's been really good, quiet time and solitude to figure out exactly what I want to say, how to say it, and then how to make the case compelling and still interesting in a way that will appeal to folks, no matter what their politics are, no matter where they sit on the ideological spectrum. So it's been an unexpected blessing to have the family time and the quiet time to finish the book. I miss happy hour. I'm on the same tank of gas today that I had on March 16th.
It's impressive.
So that tells you the extent to which I've ventured beyond the grocery store a half mile down the road.
That's awesome. I'm glad you've had that quiet time. I think most of my gas usage has been to get out of the house just to drive around in circles, but yeah. You're better than I am at that point. Last question about sort of the personal side. So I've heard you talk before about the history of your name. Mm-hmm. I was wondering if you could share that. So your name is Theodore R. Johnson. Could you share with us what the R stands for and kind of the backstory of that?
Yeah, absolutely. So the R stands for Roosevelt, and I am Theodore Roosevelt Johnson III. So I'm named after my grandfather and of course after my father. And the story of that is that President Teddy Roosevelt was first vice president, and when President McKinley is assassinated, Roosevelt rises to the presidency in September of 1901. And one of the first things he does is invite Booker T. Washington to the White House for dinner. And black men had been to the White House before. Frederick Douglass had visited, Abraham Lincoln, and even Washington had visited Roosevelt in different capacities. But this was the first time he was invited to dinner, which was a sign of social equality that wasn't done. And this was the first time ever a black man had been invited to dine socially at the White House. And it wasn't a big deal to them, but when the news of it got out the next day, the country immediately polarized with lots of white segregationists, particularly in the South, declaring Roosevelt a traitor. But a lot of black families could not believe what this symbolized, that maybe this was a taste of freedom that they would never have, but maybe would be available to their kids. So my great-grandparents looked up to Teddy Roosevelt and Booker T. Washington as a result. And when their third son was born, they named him after Teddy Roosevelt. And sort of the dinner symbolized racial equality and what was possible if you allow people to conversate, interact on equal terms. And they sort of inscribed that dream onto my grandfather through his name, and it's been passed down to me. Their first son they named James Weldon, to make James Weldon Johnson, who was he was named after the civil rights activist who wrote the National Negro Hymn. And so they kind of had this in them, their way of claiming their place in America, even though this was Jim Crow South Carolina in the early 20th century, was naming was one of the things they did. They sort of claimed greatness from great men and put it on their kids.
That's amazing. Thanks for sharing that. I really appreciate it. Was it for you and your family then to see an African American man become president? How did that interplay with that story as you thought about it?
Yeah, it was a big deal. And look, I'll be frank, I didn't really think elections mattered that much for most of my life, including as I'm serving in the military. Not voting for the commander in chief was my that's how I operate until 2008 with Obama. I filled out ballots before, but in 2000 I was in the middle of the Arabian Gulf and never mailed it off. I mean, like this, it just wasn't that important. But my whole family, my dad is a Republican, my mom is a Democrat, but they both voted for Barack Obama because of the historic nature of it, and also because his politics weren't all that different from the politics of my parents, even though they sort of grew up in different parties. So It was amazing to see a black man be elected president, and for us to, for the first time, sort of politically be on the same page. The cool thing about it is during my year as a White House fellow, I got to meet Obama on several occasions. And the last time I met him was we had a meeting with him. It was in the executive office building. We talked for about an hour or so about policy this and politics that. And then he took us over to the Oval Office and just sort of gave us a tour. And you can't see this in the pictures, but one of the walls actually there's a door in the middle of the wall that opens up to where the computer is. Like if you see the picture of the Oval Office, you never see a computer. It's because there's like another room back there where he actually receives email and signs classified papers. So he showed us the door, and right behind the door was a picture of Teddy Roosevelt trying to lead a horse up a hill. And he was telling us the story of Roosevelt, how he was one of his favorite presidents. And I said, that's the man I'm named after. And I got to tell him the story of my great grandparents standing in the Oval Office with the first black president, telling the story of these two poor sharecroppers who had the audacity to name their third son after the sitting president. Or actually, I think Roosevelt had left office by that time, but named after a president. It was sort of felt like the family story had come full circle.
Yeah, that's incredible. That's an amazing opportunity.
Yeah, it still feels a little surreal. I mean, it's been a decade now since that happened, but it still doesn't feel like the thing really happened.
Yeah, no, I can imagine. So before we get into your book, obviously, lots been happening over the last couple of weeks, to say the least.
Yeah.
And you published a really incredible piece yesterday in the National Review, which obviously is a pretty conservative outlet. I was wondering if you could sort of share the top line things that you were saying in that article, both in terms of your personal experiences, but also in terms of how you sort of talk about government overreach as it relates to the issue of racism in America.
Yeah, it was really interesting. Late last week, an editor from the National Review reached out to me and said, look, our writers have been talking about the protests happening around the country after the murder of George Floyd, but they're talking mostly about the rioting that's happening and the need to restore law and order before we can have any conversation about racial justice. And the editor said, we want to complicate the issue for our readers. Would you be interested? And I said, absolutely. And I even was telling you, I think Friday, hey, there's this opportunity, and you sort of batted it around a little bit. I think National Review they had in mind a 1,000-word or so essay. And when I started it, there was no way I was just going to drop a regular op-ed and walk away from it. So it turned out to be a 4,000-word essay. And to their credit, they were very light on the edits. I mean, everything I wanted to say, I said. They didn't pare it back at all. And so I wanted to accomplish two things. One, because of the outlet, mostly it's a conservative outlet, mostly older and white readers, I wanted to bring personal experience into it. It's easy to argue with statistics in a way that's not as easy to argue with someone's personal experiences. And I began with my military career because that tends to travel pretty well in those circles. And so I talk about, I opened the piece talking about a time when I was about to retire from the military, talking to another officer, and Colin Kaepernick this was the week he had begun kneeling during the national anthem. And my white colleague asked me about it, and the story opens with me relaying sort of these issues. But the personal part of it was that this military guy is a guy that I actually ended up in jail one night because my license had expired. And the reason they pulled me over was because I was out celebrating, smoking a cigar. And when the police saw me with the cigar, they thought it was a blunt, a marijuana-filled cigar. So they see this young black guy, 2 a.m, smoking a blunt. And I had a headlight out. And so they pulled me over. And so I talk about that ordeal. I talk about being pulled over probably about 40-ish times or so over the course of my life, and just under 30 years of driving, and how black and driving is not a trivial thing. It is actually can be quite scary, and I was terrified that night when it happened. And so I sort of use that personal story to talk about the moment that we're in the relationship of black people and law enforcement. But I tie it to how this issue reveals how the issue of racism, the issue of racial inequality, is one of the clearest ways we can see when the state, the nation, doesn't deliver on its promises to its people, when it's actually in breach of the social contract. We all know about the paradox of our founding, about declaring all men are created equal and enslaving people while that's happening, or saying, that this is a participatory democracy and only certain white men can vote, not women, not white immigrants, not Asian, Chinese immigrants, or Native Americans. So this paradox has always been with us. But the point I try to make in this essay is that nothing exposes the hypocrisy, the paradox of our identity and our founding and our principles like racism. And I think, and especially for this readership, I wanted to show that what the killing of George Floyd shows is overreach of the agents of the state, powers of the state, into the lives of people that are underprotected by the state historically, and sometimes completely excluded. And knotting those two things together, these foundational principles and sort of the current conversation about race, I thought was a way to add something additional to the conversation that may have a little bit broader appeal.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's an incredible piece. Thanks for writing it. Have you gotten, what kind of response have you gotten?
It's been bananas, actually. So I was just telling you, I think maybe about 700, 800 new followers on Twitter, 500 or so comments, close to that, on the article. And I've not dared read them, but I've had friends read them that said maybe about 10% are receptive, and 90% are sort of saying, what is this liberal trash doing on the National Review? And so it's been mixed. People who normally do not read the National Review are now reading it and saying, I can't believe they published this. I will say this, two things. One is the most heartfelt responses I've gotten are from usually older men and women, white men and women, who email me or DM me on Twitter saying, I had just never considered it the way you presented it. I don't agree with everything you said, but I see this as tied not just about whether police are racist or not, but how this is undermining foundational principles of our country. And so I appreciate that. The other one response that I got said, it was a subject with a bunch of explicitives in it, basically boo who, another black person complaining about the police when you guys know that you commit more crime, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I replied to him and said, look, this isn't an issue of black and white. This is really an issue of whether the state is delivering on its promises to its people. And maybe in 4 sentences. And I replied back to him, and he sent me a 1.5-page reply. The first thing he said is, Mr. Johnson, I'm sorry. I was harsh in my email. I was taking my anger out on you. And let me just tell you where I'm coming from. And he told me how he had been abused by the police and no one cared, that he didn't get the attention Floyd is getting, or that Ahmaud Arbery is getting, or black men beaten by the police. And he talked about how he felt like he was tired of being blamed for all of society's problems as a white man. And then he invited me, if I was ever in Roanoke, Virginia, to come out and have a beer with him. So those are the two things that have stuck with me most. And I think the third, if there is one, is just the amount of sharing of the article on social media that I didn't anticipate but I'm super happy to see.
That's amazing. Yeah. And I think it's also interesting. I mean, I think winning the comment section is pretty hard, no matter what you write. But you never know who changes hearts and minds get changed, even if they never comment or they never email you, let alone to be able to change the mind of someone who was being aggressively rude to you is pretty incredible. So congrats on that.
No, thank you. And the work that you guys do, and just sort of the ecosystem of people thinking about polarization and how do we create deeper connections. There's the case to be made from a public policy standpoint, super important, but there's the case to be made in the court of public opinion too. And the only way it works is if you engage audiences that normally would not come find you where you are. And so you have to kind of go to them in a way that's humble, maybe a little vulnerable, but it sort of meets them on their terms to share your story. So it's long-term work, but hopefully we're making dents here.
Yeah, amen. Well, that's a good transition. So the name of your book is When the Stars Begin to Fall. It's about, as you phrase it, it's about national solidarity and racism. So I guess my first question is, what's the title about? Where does that phrase come from?
Yeah, so it comes from an old Negro spiritual. W.B. Du Bois, in his book, The Souls of Black Folk, calls it one of the 10 sorrow songs. And it was a song that was sung by enslaved people, and they would sing it in the field. You weren't allowed to sing about wanting your freedom or wanting liberty or emancipation, but you could sing about church, Christ, Christianity. And so When the Stars Begin to Fall is ostensibly a song about the rapture, about Christ coming back and sort of the sky blotting out and the stars falling and, the saints ascending, etc. But what the song was really about was the day, there was a new day where you now have your freedom. And so they sort of cloaked a song about liberty and emancipation in a song about the rapture. And so the stars falling has a sort of celestial quality to it, but it's really about here, very terrestrial sort of liberty. So that's where it comes from. It's a line out. I think the Carpenters in the 1960s made it a popular folk song, and so it was like a very down south, rugged work song. Hit mainstream pop culture in the 60s.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
So what? Tell us the central argument of your book. How would you describe that?
Yeah, it's basically argues three things. The first thing is racism is an existential threat to America. And that's a really overplayed term these days. Everything's an existential threat to everything else. But the argument is that while the United States as a geopolitical entity has proven it can survive a racist society and has done so since its inception, I separate out the United States as the nation state from America, which I say represents the principles we care about: liberty, equality, life, the pursuit of happiness, like all of those things wrapped up in the preamble in our Constitution. And so the argument is racism is a threat to the ideas that we hold dear. And the United States may endure just fine with racial inequality, economic inequality, all sorts of liberalism. But the idea of America, that we're all created equal, and racial inequality, structural racism, those things cannot coexist. One either as one grows, the other sort of recedes. And so if we allow racism to prosper, then the American idea is essentially a lie. It will cease to exist, in my view. So racism is the threat. The second is that the answer to racism is solidarity that crosses racial lines. And so I spent a considerable part of the book talking about the idea of solidarity, and then why solidarity has been so difficult to establish among people of different races and ethnicities, and then what are some ways that we can try to establish this multiracial, multi-ethnic solidarity. And I think if we are able to do that, then that provides us the tools, the instruments we need to take on racism and thus save the American idea. The third bit is the model for that national solidarity can be found in Black America. And so I talk about characteristics that Black Americans as a group, attributes of the group, strategies of the group that have been employed since coming to America, being brought here, as a way to manage slavery, Jim Crow, these very harsh effects of racism as a group that have helped the nation become more democratic, more participatory over time. And then try to extrapolate those attributes and show that how the nation as a whole can adopt them and then try to establish a solidarity across lines that typically divide us.
That's awesome. So can you give us an example of one of those tools or strategies that have worked in the Black community?
Yeah. And the one point that I make is, so I talk about racism as a white-black binary in the book because Black America is sort of the model that I'm using to make the argument. But I also acknowledge that this is much more complicated than that. So many of the attributes that I pull out of Black America exist in different ways in other groups that have had to fight for equality. So it's not that these things are exclusive to Black Americans, but there was a very particular application of these things or distinct attributes or distinct parts of these attributes that are specific to the Black experience. So one of them I call superlative citizenship. And this is the idea that even when the state when they renege on their deal, on their side of the social contract, when they're in breach of it, they don't deliver on the rights and privileges of citizenship to all of its people, that the people who have been marginalized, excluded from that, still behave as though they have all of those rights and privileges, which means they're still paying their taxes, even though they can't go to the public school because it's segregated. It means that they're still serving in the military, even though when they return from the military service, before the Civil War, they were often returned back to slavery. And after the Civil War, World War I, II, even Korea, they returned back to Jim Crow society where they were, a few of them were lynched in uniform, beaten in uniform, coming back from war. But they still served and cut out of public policy from housing and education and all sorts of federal assistance. Yet they still managed to declare their citizenship by doing all the things good citizens do. A couple of ways they've done this. One, which has fallen out of favor, is respectability politics. This is the idea. This was a survival mechanism for many Black folks in the early 20th century, because the thinking was if you dress like mainstream society, if you speak like mainstream society, if you comport yourself like what the mainstream considers a good citizen, then perhaps they will be less harsh on you should something happen. And so respectability became a way of winning over hearts and minds by sort of conforming to what mainstream society considered to be dignified. And so superlative citizenship, the concept wraps up things like respectability politics, military service, as a way of showing that you can still be a good, solid citizen, even when the state doesn't recognize you as such, as a way of building the case that you are capable, worthy, and have the right to be treated as a full and equal American.
And how do you feel? I mean, because obviously we see, no matter who you can be, the wealthiest, the most powerful, whatever, you can be in the military, as you said, and yet racism is still there. So how do you think about that concept of respectability politics today?
Yeah, so I think it has its place. I've written critiquing respectability politics, and I've written in support of it because it depends on the situation. The Black Lives Matter movement, certainly in 2015, 2016, rejected it. And I think part of the issue is that when respectability is seen as a shield from racism, right, then it's wrong. And it should be, we should speak very clearly that that's not the advantage that respectability politics gives you, because it doesn't deliver. But what it does do is respectability is a part of American life. When you go to a job interview, you're probably wearing a tie if you're a guy. You probably have a good haircut. You probably, you present yourself in a respectable way. So respectability can be a strategy, which was what was employed in the civil rights movement. Nonviolent plus respectability meant the visuals of German shepherds and fire hoses and police with batons beating civilized people showed us who was really the barbarian in this instance. And it wasn't these Black people with less intellect and biologically inferior, like all of the conspiracy theories and tropes going on about Black people. These were the people behaving like Americans, and it was the powers of the state that were behaving inappropriately. Respectability was key to that strategy. And so I still think there's a place for it. Barack Obama is the definition of 21st century Black respectability. He doesn't get elected president unless he is that. And I think it is a good thing for race relations in the country and for sort of the Black American culture that we had a good, respectable president. while also understanding that that respectability still made him very hated in corners of the country, and that respectability never protected me when I got pulled over by police. You know, so it has its limits.
Oh, I think we lost you for a second there. Yeah, no, you were saying it has its limits.
Yeah, I was saying it has its limits, but it still has its utility.
Got it. Okay, that's really interesting. I know we're about out of time. I want to first give you a chance. So, if folks are interested in your book, I know it's delayed a little bit because of coronavirus and all that.
Yeah,
How did they get it?
It's will be published by Grove Atlantic. It was supposed to be in February of next year, but COVID has pushed it back to probably just after Memorial Day of 2021 through Grove Atlantic, and I hope to have pre-orders available by the end of this year.
Awesome. And last question: if you have a hope of what comes out of the last 2 weeks, what is it that you hope will change?
The biggest thing is that these protests around the killing of George Floyd, but also around Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, they have occurred in every single state in the country, and they are extremely multicultural, multiracial, multi-ethnic, many different religions, ages, sexes, sexual orientations. This is like a swath of America that has come together in a way that I don't know that we've seen in our lifetime for this long. I mean, it's just been a couple of weeks, but that's substantial. Marches happening every day, every state in the country. What I hope is that endures when politics have moved on. That the connections that are being formed, especially at the local and community levels, between people who normally didn't talk to one another because of how their neighborhoods are segregated or their schools or whatever, that they continue to keep the relationships that they've created in the protest movement to create change at the local level, and more importantly, create strong bonds of kinship with one another at the local level. If that is the only product, policing reform needs to happen. I hope bills get passed. But if that doesn't happen, but people at the community level now have new connections with new Americans, new peoples, new neighbors, I think that will, in the long term, and frankly, in the short term, this being a presidential election year, will reap dividends and pay off for the nation in more ways than one, beyond just policy, but also in our culture.
Absolutely. Dr. Ted Johnson, thank you so much for coming on. Thanks for everything you're doing. Thanks for the amazing article you wrote yesterday. And yeah, we appreciate you.
Thank you. No, same to you guys. Keep up the good work, man. I'm a fan.
I appreciate it. Well, thanks everyone for tuning in. You can join us next Friday. We're going to have our amazing board member, Dr. Reverend Leslie Copeland-Toon, talking about the holiday of Juneteenth. And we hope to see you every Friday. And you can see us online, oneamericamovement.org. Get involved in our work to bring this country together by dealing with the hard stuff and having these kinds of hard conversations. Have a great weekend, everyone.